Really good to be here. I am so grateful to the organizers and honored to be on the same panel with Dimitris and Cynthia. So over the last several years, energy access has increased dramatically across the world. In just one decade, India electrified 100,000 villages. 300 million more people now have electricity, which is great. But what we don't talk about as much is the quality of electricity. And in some cases, that quality is abysmal. In one study, it reported that New Delhi experienced 1,000 power outages in just a single month. There are other problems with maintenance and quality of supply in India and, in fact, many parts of the world. Reliability problems remain stubbornly high. In places like Ghana, they experienced a power crisis that lasted several years. South Africa continues to struggle with meeting demand for electricity. So we often think of these types of problems as technical problems. Here's one chart that just documents rates of transmission and distribution losses over time. India, in some sense, sticks out as an outlier, but in fact, transmission and distribution losses have been, in some parts of the world, increasing in recent decades, that very same time period in which the world has worked so hard to increase access. At some level, these are technical problems, but more fundamentally, they are also political problems. And the fact that there continue to be reliability issues in much of the power sector suggests that there are enormous inefficiencies that continue, that still need to be solved. So a while back, I was at the headquarters of the Uttar Pradesh Power Corporation. Sitting in a windowless room with a bunch of power engineers, I listened to them as they talked about their challenges. They are the ones who are tasked with the job of supplying and deciding which of the 200 million people that live in Uttar Pradesh will get electricity that day. There are technical guidelines they need to follow, and there are certainly technical constraints that shape the decision work that they make each day. But layered on top of that is enormous political pressure made by politicians of all stripes to ensure that the power corporation is providing power, providing electricity, if it can, to their constituencies on any given day. And when the total availability of supply is far, far short of actual demand, that means that every decision about who experiences a power cut and who does not get reliable access to power is a political one. Let me just tell you one quick story about one politician who was elevated to the position of energy minister in 1997. He defected and joined the ruling party, and as a result got this promotion. And I want you to take a glance at what his constituency of Hardoi looked like in the years that followed. In 1997, aside from the central city of Hardoi, much of the southern part of his constituency was dark. But in the years that followed, light increased so dramatically that satellites at night were capturing this dramatic explosion of light until the end of 2001, in which Naresh Agarwal was sacked from his post for political disloyalty. And once he lost the reins of power over the energy ministry, Hardoi was knocked back to exactly where it was at the beginning. So images of annual averages like this can detect really dramatic political distortions of this sort. But annual composites don't do nearly enough to really tell you what we care about on the ground and what most citizens and residents care about on the ground, which is what is actually happening in their communities on a day-to-day basis. So our team has been relying on new data to dive even more deeply into studying access and reliability at new levels of spatial and temporal resolution. More recently, nighttime satellite imagery has been coming from the VIR satellite, which has much more high resolution and captures images every single night that can be used as inputs into our estimates. We also take advantage of newer data that's been produced on the location of human settlements. So this is data produced by a team at Facebook, but there are other products now available from several research teams that identify the location of every building in many parts of the world. And so if we zoom in on one portion of Kenya here, you can see a daytime image, and overlaid on top of that, each of those pixels represents a computer vision identified settlement or a building. We take it as our job to take each of these settlement pixels and classify them according to new metrics of energy access and reliability for those pixels. And so the final product is something like this, in which every single pixel gets coded with some new estimate of the likelihood that that pixel is electrified and a new estimate of the reliability of power for that settlement. The general principle of these indicators, which we call high resolution electricity access indicators, is a reliance on nightly comparisons of light output in settlement locations compared to a matched set of pixels that do not have settlements. And so the notion is relatively simple. We know in some rural area that there is a building in a particular location. We then scan the satellite imagery to find proximate pixels that are nearby, but for which we know that there are no settlements, and which we know that that match some characteristics of that settlement pixel, namely the type of land cover that that settlement pixel is located. And we do this for every single pixel on every single night independently. Now, the advantage of this approach is that it really takes full advantage of all of the information that exists in a specific nightly image. Now, if you looked at just one nightly image, you would notice most likely there's clouds, there's other types of atmospheric disturbances, there's a specific level of lunar illumination that's interacting with the type of dirt, soil, tree cover that exists on a certain plot of land to generate certain type of background reflectivity. And so by using that information, we can identify each night a statistical estimate of how likely it is that the level of light we observe over that settlement pixel is due to anthropogenic sources, that it does not look like background light. With these estimates that we have for every single night, we're then able to aggregate each of those daily estimates to compute an overall annual estimate of the likelihood lit that we just scale from 0 to 1 for convenience, and also a measure of frequency lit, which we can use as a rough indicator of the proportion of nights over a calendar year that this pixel had electricity. So the final output looks something like this. Here is a portion of Kenya outside of Nairobi, in which we can identify that many of the pixels located in the capital city generate so much light so consistently across the calendar year that our algorithm predicts essentially a 100% likelihood of electrification. But just some miles away in some of the neighboring districts, we can see that there are many communities in which, or many settlements, we should say, where the likelihood of electrification is computed to be lower. Overall, using all of these classifications, we can then generate a national estimate of the electrification access rate. Now, that's useful because for many years, that's kind of been the closest we have to a gold standard estimate of electricity access. And so on the y-axis here is the World Bank's estimate of electricity access, the national electrification rate. And on the x-axis is our satellite-derived estimate. And so for this first group that we ran this analysis on of 33 countries over a handful of years, we see really high correlation, which is pretty remarkable when you think about the surveys upon which the World Bank estimates were based on, all of the kind of detailed ground level work that went in to compute these annual estimates from the World Bank side. that we can do this just using automated methods, using publicly derived data sets to compute this with satellite data and essentially see basically the same thing. Zooming in even more closely and doing more ground truth types of comparisons, we can also see that our estimates generate estimates that we think are pretty reliable, at least compared to what other things we know. And so in one study done by Lee and co-authors at Berkeley, they did household surveys in a bunch of villages in Kenya. And if you look at that's their lower panel, their map of who has electricity access, who does not, and you compare it to the satellite-based estimates that we compute above. There's general correspondence in many of the values that we see. Overall then, the use of nightly satellite data, in particular, taking advantage of the full time series that exists from 2012 up until the present now in the case of VIIRS, allows us to identify variations in both energy access, but also, as we're looking at here, estimates of the reliability of electricity access at a high level of spatial resolution. In places like Nepal, which also experienced for many years a series of compounded power crises, you can monitor and you can identify the impacts, exactly where in the country the impacts of this power crisis was most severe. We can overlay that data on other types of maps as well. This is just overlaying some of the estimates now computed for Ghana over the local map of Accra. In 2013, a power crisis was just getting going in Ghana. By 2015, that power crisis reached a peak, so much so that it became a political embarrassment for the ruling party. And by 2016, in the presidential election, the power crisis was, in many ways, a defining issue of the presidential election. The president's party did not win re-election; they were voted out. It's now clear that the improvement in results we saw by 2017 was simply due to that political change. There were a lot of other changes that happened as well, but by 2017, the power reliability stabilized in much of Accra. Lastly, I'll just mention that even though I was describing a lot of work using the new VIIRS data, DMSP was also collected on a nightly basis. It's a little bit noisier with much coarser resolution, but even with that coarse resolution, we're able to generate estimates of power supply reliability in older time periods, and so in older time frames. And so this is an image of 2013, but the DMSP series goes back to 1992, which really opens up the possibility of tracking improvements in access and reliability across periods of time, so that ultimately we can better understand what explains variations in reliability around the world. Thank you.
Thank you for that. That was really, really interesting. Some questions are popping up in the Q&A, and we can go for about 5 minutes. You kind of mentioned your automated method as essentially replicating the results of like World Bank surveys. Do you see these nightlight-based techniques ultimately replacing surveys that are done on the ground?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I don't think we're ever going to replace the kind of nuanced information you get from interviewing and talking to individual households about their specific needs and their usage patterns. I really think of these as complementary approaches. The thing that the nightlights and satellite approaches can do that no survey-based approach can do is to repeat the visit rate, to continually go back every single night in this case and ask and kind of this, you know, from a technical sense, ask the same question over and over. Is there any light coming from your community tonight? But we still need the surveys. I will say too that I think the work on the survey side has really been improving over the last several years, basically acknowledging more and more this issue that access is no longer a binary indicator. I think there's better appreciation now that access is a continuum because of all of the challenges of reliability.
Right. Somebody's curious if you've explored the use of other data, just going beyond lights at night and population, and if so, how did that work?
Yeah, so we've been really focused on trying to leverage data sets that are widely accessible and available. I think we heard earlier from Dimitris. I think there's lots of possibilities that are possible in specific locations in specific countries in which you have access to more infrastructure data. I don't know what other kinds of data perhaps are in mind behind that question, but I'll say, the other piece that we did use or incorporate here that ended up being very, very important was the land cover type data. And so that's the MODIS-derived land cover data that ended up being actually a hugely important data source that I don't think is as utilized, is not used as carefully as it needs to be for those of us who work with night lights, because it ends up that how much light your location emits at night is so highly driven by how much moonlight there is that night and the type of land that you're sitting on. So we do need to incorporate other data sources. But the idea of the approach is that it's kind of broad and flexible and that we could incorporate more.
Kind of in a similar idea is looking at daytime reliability using remote sensing. Do you know, is that something you're working on, or if others are tackling as well?
Oh boy, I love that question. I mean, that's the biggest constraint or biggest weakness of the nighttime lights approach, is that even though you see whether there's light at night, it's really just one point of time every single night. And in fact, with VIIRS, the overpass time is not really ideal for these types of applications, because that overpass time can be 1 a.m. or 2 a.m. in many places. So really you would prefer 9 p.m., 10 p.m. types of approaches. So I don't actually know that these daytime approaches using remote sensing. I think there was a lightning talk that talked about kind of ground-based sensor approaches, but I think we're going to have to work together from multiple angles to be able to get to build our sense of exactly what happens throughout the 24-hour cycle.
Okay. And I think we probably have time for maybe two more questions. What do you think is kind of the biggest set of obstacles to adopting nighttime light-based approaches?
This is one I'm happy to talk about, because here's an obstacle, but then there's a solution at the end of this. So one obstacle traditionally has been that we only really had access to annual composites or monthly composites. Getting access to the nightly images, like actually what does a village look like every single night over a calendar year, was possible in theory, but actually really challenging from a technical standpoint of getting the data providers to do those data extractions for you. So I've been working with the World Bank over the last several years, and NOAA, the group that actually collects and archives a lot of the scientific data. I wish we're ready to make the full announcement right now, but in literally the coming days or weeks, please keep your eyes open for the Lights Every Night data release, which will open up access to the entire VIIRS nightly archive. Every single individual image captured by the VIIRS satellites since 2012. All of it will be housed on an AWS server through its public datasets program. And so that obstacle, getting individual nightly images, we hope will be going away very soon.
There's a question, and I'd like to add to it as well. You mentioned kind of the technical and political challenges. Are there others, like consumer ability to pay, or also, if I can add to that, is it relevant at all whether they're public utilities, government-owned utilities versus private utilities, and how that kind of plays into this?
Yeah, no, that's a great and important question. I mean, it is not. I mean, there are some fundamental technical ones that I think are worth just reminding ourselves of. I mean, I live in a home, we have a smart meter. When the power goes out, the utility automatically gets a ping and knows that there's something wrong. That's an expensive technology and is not deployed in many parts of the developing world. And so providing reliable access to power and knowing how much your consumers are using on a regular basis is actually a big challenge for many utilities. And I don't think it matters whether you're private or public. That said, in much of the developing world, they have gone the public route. Most utilities continue to be owned by the government because it's seen as such a critical national resource, and yet they haven't done a very good job in providing reliability. So I think this kind of just information or data challenge or data constraint is like compounding. It's not just that it shields the consumers or citizens from understanding like how political distortions are happening, but I think it also makes it hard for utilities to know exactly when they're sending power out to the grid, 20% of it gets lost before it ends up getting used. Where was it lost? They don't really always have a good idea of that either.
That's an interesting point. Maybe to wrap up the Q&A, somebody who also works kind of in the energy access space is curious how much you or the algorithm is learning with each new application, and if they have a data set that's ground truth with reliability information in a particular country, would it be helpful if they send that to you or provide that?
Oh yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, I appreciate that very much. I mean, I would love to keep talking with people that are working on different research projects on reliability, because as I said, I think it is kind of the next big frontier. We've been focused on access for so long, and yet reliability, I mean, I think in some ways we've kind of ignored it just because it's been so hard to study and measure. And so if you have any data or interest on these issues, I would love to talk with you and see. I mean, we now have these estimates computed for about 70 countries around the world, so I'm always kind of eager too to share it with people that are working on different settings and say, like, could you compare it with the data you have and see what we can do with this?
That was great, and that was very interesting, and I really appreciate you taking the time to join us and sharing your work and answering our questions.